Okay, I'd like to begin by saying thanks to Carol and thanks to the Institute on Aging for the invitation. It's a real honor to be able to stand up here and tell you a little bit about what keeps me busy, what I think about in terms of the research that I've been involved in for a while. I must say the first talk was fantastically interesting. I hope mine is interesting as well. I have to apologize in advance. No cool brain photos, no kind of scary-looking bodybuilders, and definitely no stones. So I hope the graphs are sufficient. As Carol said, I'm in the Department of Sociology. I'm a demographer, which basically means that in contrast probably to the other speakers that you're going to be hearing from today, I work with large social survey data. Large surveys, we use these to try to estimate associations between different individual characteristics and outcomes we're interested in, well-being, economic well-being, or health, or things like this, and then try to think about or evaluate the ways in which those relationships inform our understanding of broader population processes. For example, health inequality or economic inequality in old age. So a very different kind of approach to science, as Carol said. We're going to be getting the spectrum, but that's kind of what I do. And also, rather than providing, for better or for worse, I'm not going to provide a broad overview of the field, but rather I'm going to try to summarize and share with you the results of 3 very closely related studies that I've been doing over the past few years in collaboration with colleagues here, University of Minnesota, and University of Indiana. So we've got sort of our Midwestern Big Ten collaboration here on this particular subject. So I will, without further ado, jump right in and tell you that this is the main question that I will be focusing on today. Do the experiences that we have across our lives, in our work domain, in our family domain, help to shape our well-being in older ages, well-being broadly defined? And I'm sure as you look at this question, you all think, well, that's a silly question. Of course it does. And I would have to agree. But the question really becomes, how do we think about this question? This is obviously way too broad a question to answer in any kind of meaningful scientific way. And depending on the specific question that we're interested in with the ways in which our lives shape well-being at older ages, it's not quite so clear. And I hope I can also convince you that in terms of the data that are required to actually summarize in a meaningful way the extent of our experiences in our work and family lives across multiple years, that's not such an easy task. So those are a couple of the things that I hope I can convince you of today. And under this broader question, I'd like to think about a few more specific questions. If there is indeed some relationship between our lived experience in the work and family domain and our health and economic well-being at older age, how does that come about? What are the mechanisms? What are the pathways? And I'm going to, as I said, talk about 3 very specific studies that look at one or more very particular types of relationships, and I'm going to walk you through those and hopefully convince you that they're interesting and worth thinking about in more detail. I'd also like to think about what it is about life experiences that matter. Does it matter that we're just stably employed across our life? Or does the kind of job we have across our life matter? Does it matter whether or not we were stably married across our lives? Or does it matter when we got married and entered that stable marriage? These are the kind of questions that I won't have time to talk about in great detail with you, but these are the kind of questions that inform the work that we're doing. And importantly, I'm very interested in thinking about the ways in which these relationships we observe might differ for men and for women. I'll come back to this later, but I don't have to tell anybody in this room that over the course of the past 50 or 60 or 70 years, there have been massive changes in the ways in which men and women, respectively and relative to each other, organize their lives with potential implications for these relationships. I'm actually going to be working with data that I will explain to you, talk to you about in a minute, that represent kind of a transitional cohort, people who are in their 70s right now. So women who experience partially, if you will, a lot of the real major changes in family and work across the life force. And I'm going to be drinking a lot here. I apologize. I'm at the very end of a cold, so bear with me as I hydrate. I'm going to talk about 3 specific studies. The first 2 look like this. Ultimately, we're interested in understanding differences across individuals in economic well-being or health. And as I'll tell you a little bit more in a minute, we're thinking about these 2 measures of well-being very broadly. Many different measures of economic well-being, several different measures of health, physical health, emotional health, cognitive health. We're thinking about this broadly. But this diagram here shows how social scientists typically study the predictors or correlates or factors associated with well-being. Typically we measure things like your family circumstances, your work circumstances, your friendships, your social involvement, about the same time that we measure health. So let's just say that we're measuring these things at age 65. These are typically measured around age 60, 65 or something like that. So the question is really an associational one. How are your characteristics at older ages associated with these outcomes, these measures of well-being that we're interested in at older ages? We want to look at it a little bit differently. The question a little differently. And we want to think about the extent to which everything that came before this, your work and family experiences across the life course, from early adulthood through midlife, through early old age, to what extent are they related to these outcomes of interest? I think we know a little bit about this, the ways in which experiences across your life, your marital experiences, your work experiences, are related to the things that the profile you take into older ages, if you will. The health circumstances, the family circumstances, your friendship networks, the kinds of things that we sort of approach old age with are ourselves. We think we know a little bit about this relationship. I would argue that from an academic perspective or an intellectual perspective, this is really interesting, I think. From a scientific or policy perspective, I would argue that it doesn't really matter all that much if this is all that's going on. If these things predict these things, which then predict these things, knowing this relationship is really just an intellectual exercise. It's cool to know, but it doesn't really help us understand anything about variation in later life well-being that we couldn't learn just from looking at this, okay? What we're really interested in is this, okay? Even after we account for all of the things that the characteristics, family, work characteristics that we take into old age, that we know are related to economic well-being, that we know are related to our health outcomes, is there any residual relationship with our life experiences? Is there anything here that doesn't go indirectly through our later life characteristics? And if so, what might that be? So I'm not sure if the graph makes perfect sense, so let me re-express this verbally. Another way to think about this is to ask the question, does it matter how you got to where you are at age 65? Do those experiences across your life tell us anything above and beyond what they tell us about where you got to, the profile that you take into older ages? So hopefully that makes sense. There's a lot of sociological and social scientific theorizing that our experiences may matter above and beyond. A messy life, for example, may matter above and beyond the implications it has for the health and economic profile we take into older ages. I'm going to show you this diagrammatically in a few minutes, and I hope it makes more sense if it doesn't make good sense to you right now. But that's the first set of questions that we're going to be interested in. The second set of questions is somewhat different, and I want to set this one up by taking a little bit of time. Here we're going to be thinking about perhaps the ultimate measure of well-being at older ages, survival. Okay? So, we know a lot about the factors that predict survival or longer lives or shorter lives. And what we're doing in this particular study is building on a very provocative study that a couple of colleagues, both of whom are retired right now, very successfully aging former professors, did several years ago. And in that study, basically what they did was to address a large body of research that looks at the relationship between IQ and survival, IQ and mortality, intelligence and mortality, basically showing that on average it appears that more intelligent people live longer with intelligence measured as scores on some kind of IQ or other intelligence tests. This is a widely studied relationship, and there are many different positive explanations for that observed relationship. What's really cool about this particular study is that these two colleagues were able to take advantage of a very unique data source that is actually the same data source that I will be using and describing to you in a minute to look at some other factors in early adolescence. In particular, what they did was they introduced into their model of mortality a measure of high school rank, where you ranked in the grade point, your grade point average in high school. And what they found, very surprisingly to them, was that people who did better in high school lived longer. And more importantly than that, once they accounted for high school rank, the relationship between intelligence and longer lives went away. So high school rank, of course, is correlated with intelligence, but it's not that strongly correlated with intelligence. And this led them to sort of postulate or speculate about what it might be that high school rank represents that is protective or helps us to live longer. And they came up with a range of different plausible factors, such as conscientiousness. The phrase they used was doing the right thing at the right time, or following rules. Okay? So this is their sort of speculative interpretation of this finding. I don't think we know what it is, but when we read that paper, we thought, well, we know an awful lot about the way in which sort of planfulness, following the rules, being conscientious in adolescence contributes to the kinds of lives we unfold for ourselves, if you will, and ask the question, is this measure of high school rank, in whatever it might proxy, related to mortality via more successful or more stable life courses, family and work life courses? So another way to think about this would be to ask, does adolescent academic performance, as measured by high school rank, promote longevity by helping to put people on more stable or successful life paths? And again, here we're looking, when we talk about life paths, we're thinking about our marital histories and our employment histories. Okay, I'll tell you more about how we measure those in just a minute. But those are the two sets of questions that inform these three studies. And I kind of want to walk you through the results if I can. But before I do that, let me just very briefly take a minute to hopefully convince you that this is more than just some researchers sitting in a room crunching numbers and thinking about potentially interesting things. I think there's a lot of value in understanding these relationships from a practical perspective, from a policy perspective, from a social perspective. One of the most important factors is the rapid aging of the baby boom. So I was born in 1964, so I'm the last official year of the baby boom. But I know there are many, many, many people several years older than me who are further toward old age than I am, further toward retirement and old age. And obviously this is a huge policy issue with respect to thinking about the implications for public policy, for supporting older people, for the implications for family support for older aging family members. There's a whole host of reasons, demographic reasons generated by the baby boom, to be particularly interested in understanding what factors contribute to variation in well-being at older ages. So I've mentioned that. And I've already sort of somewhat alluded to the changes that women have experienced across their life courses and thinking about the implications of those changes for understanding differences in well-being at older ages and how that may have changed over time. But it's not just women. I look out at the room and I see that there are many people who have lived lives in a period of what I would argue is real fundamental social and economic change. Massive restructuring of the family life course. Large increases in divorce, family instability, remarriages, step-families, much more complexity in the family life course than there was in previous generations. Much more variation across groups and across individuals. Changing employment circumstances. Certainly, the notion of working for one employer for your entire career, retiring and going off into the sunset, that's an image of the work-life course that is long gone, I think. There's many studies showing since 1975 or the mid-70s the rise in precarious employment, the rise in the very uneven employment across the life course, if you will. People working in unstable jobs, people working in low-paying jobs, jobs that don't provide health insurance, jobs that don't provide pension benefits. Of course, there are many people who work in jobs that are very good. The point I'm trying to make is there's a lot more variation across the population in terms of the experiences that people have across their lives with respect to the nature of employment. And I've already mentioned the changing roles for women. So these are some sort of big reasons to care about these linkages between what comes before old age and what happens subsequent to entering old age, however we define that entry. The question is, what's coming? The baby boomers are approaching old age. 15 years, I'll be 65, I'll be retiring, perhaps. Many of my cohort compatriots have already reached that point, and I think there's a great deal of interest in understanding what's coming. So what we're going to be doing is working with a large survey of people who are born just prior to the baby boom, and trying to understand from their life experiences what might be coming down the road with respect to the baby boomers. So, I'm not going to spend much time on this, but there are also very practical and scientific reasons to care about these relationships, these questions that I'm talking about. In particular, it really matters with respect to what kind of data should we be collecting. If we're really interested in understanding variation in well-being at older ages, and if your life course really matters, then that has implications for the kind of data we need to collect to understand variation in well-being at older ages. It's not simply enough, in that case, to start a survey of older individuals and ask them to tell us retrospectively about your lives. Rather, it's important that we follow them across their lives and document experiences in the marriage, in the family domain, and in the work domain, so that we can understand how they got to the situations they're at older ages. And obviously, these two kinds of surveys have massively different implications for the cost and time involved. It's very easy to, I shouldn't say it's very easy, it's easier to collect a large survey of older people and ask them retrospectively to tell us about their lives. It's a heck of a lot more difficult, time-consuming, and expensive to start a study of young people, newborns or high school students, follow them throughout their lives, and then answer these questions. So to the extent that the kinds of linkages between life course experiences and later life well-being that I'm talking about as motivating our research are relevant, then this has implications for the kind of data that we need to be thinking about collecting. So fortunately, as I mentioned, we have this very unique resource. Again, the first speaker mentioned a couple of unique Wisconsin-based resources. This is another extremely unique Wisconsin-based resource called the Wisconsin Longitudinal Study. Some of you may have heard of this, some of you may even be participants. If you are a participant, you have my heartfelt thanks and the thanks of many researchers around the world for your continued engagement in the survey. This is a survey that was done in 1957, interviewed 1/3 of the graduating class of Wisconsin high schools in 1957. And they have been re-interviewed, those graduates have been interviewed first at age 18, have been re-interviewed at age 35, 54, 65, and 72. So we followed these people for over 50 years and have periodically asked them to tell us about their marital and work experiences. So we have full employment histories. We know all of the jobs people have held and the characteristics of those jobs since age 35. We know about every marriage, when it took place, whether it survived, when it dissolved, how it dissolved, when people remarried. We know everything about the marital histories of these people from age 18. And these aren't data that were asked of people at age 65 or 70, when the recollection might not be perfect. These were asked more or less in real time. So this is a real resource. It started out at about 10,000, and there's about 7,000, 8,000 remaining. Yeah. So I told you we're studying mortality, so some of them have died, yes. But it's a very large survey. And really, as far as I know, the only one of its kind in the world. There are other surveys that include people of about my age who've been followed since age 14 or 15. But we can't really answer the kind of questions that I want to answer yet. Give us another 15, 20, 30 years. Another real strength of this study is that when they were 65 and 72, these respondents provided us with a tremendous amount of information about various aspects of economic well-being. Wealth, home equity, savings, pension wealth, income, household income, a whole range of characteristics, and an even more impressive range of measures of health. Self-rated health, work-limiting conditions, specific chronic health conditions, depressive symptoms, cognitive health, a whole range of different health measures. And I'm not going to be able to tell you obviously about each of these, but the point I want to make is that we're casting a really wide net to try to consider the ways in which life trajectories might be related to a range of different outcomes. I see it. Should I take questions as we go? I'm going to have to finish the talk and save the question for the end, I'm told, okay? If that's all right.
72 is possible, is it? 72 is possible to have that. I'm 69, and I was not.
Let me come back to the question at the end, if that's all right. I better move ahead. I apologize for that. The other thing that's important about this study for our purposes is that we have information on the timing of death of all of the graduates who have deceased, have passed away. So that's important for that third study. So let me move along. With the full life history from age 18 or age 35 for employment, that's a lot of data. We can measure these things down to the half-year interval. So for every 6-month period in their lives, we have a point of data. And we have it for multiple measures. Whether or not you're employed, whether or not your employer provides health insurance, whether or not it's a low-paying job, part-time, blah, blah, blah. How in the world do you summarize that? It's a real difficult question. One might think, well, we can just sort of use common sense and distinguish people who were always married from people who were never married and people who experienced a marital dissolution. We might use common sense to characterize employment histories as well, people who were always employed, people who were never employed, homemakers, and people who bounced in and out of the labor force. We do that. But that's kind of unsatisfying because that really depends on our sort of subjective approach to how we choose to characterize people's lives. So there are many statistical tools that we might use to generate statistically meaningful classifications of individual life histories. So I want to show you, I'm not going to go into the details, but I want to show you the results of one set of analyses that provide us with discrete classifications of individual people into life trajectories. This will be for women's employment. The outcome is just, are you or are you not employed at a given age? These are the trajectories. The vertical axis here is the predicted probability of being employed. And we see that about half of the Wisconsin graduates, the female Wisconsin graduates, were consistently employed. The predicted probability is always near 1 between ages 36 and 54. We have longer trajectories, but I'm just showing this for an example. So about half were employed across the life course. Another 13% were what we call late entry workers, not employed in the 30s, 20s, but entering the labor force in the late 30s and being pretty much fully employed across the 40s and early 50s. One might think that's the family then work group. A very small, surprisingly small proportion of women in the Wisconsin longitudinal study were what we call never employed or homemakers, only 10 or 11%. That was surprising to us too. Remember, these are all high school graduates. We have a small group of 12 who were sort of unstably employed across the life course, entering a little bit later, but kind of bouncing around. And another group that bounced around in a somewhat different way. So less stable employment, no employment, stable employment. So this is one way that we have worked to take this massive data and to, in a statistically meaningful way, concatenate or summarize it so that we can use it in these analyses as predictors of later life well-being. I mentioned earlier that one way to think about that first set of analyses is to ask the question, or to think about the question as this: does it matter how you got to age 65 and how you came to possess the various characteristics that you take into old age, or is that all that matters? Let's take a look at this to sort of better articulate that idea. If we were just looking at people at age 54, all the people in these three groups would be observed as employed. The people in these two groups would probably be observed as not employed. That's all we would know. Is that enough? These three groups, the orange, the green, and the yellow, they got here through very different life pathways. And the way to think about our question is, once we account for where they are here, does this matter? That's what we're asking. Okay. We're not going to be able to tell you what it means if it does matter, but we're going to at least take the first step and ask, does it matter? That's the next step. The answer, yes, trajectories do matter. You could tell by the way I set it up that they were going to matter. But yes, we find very consistently across a number of different outcomes, a number of different ways of summarizing life histories, that they do provide information above and beyond the information that we get from just looking at where you are, say at age 65, or something like that. I'll give you just a very few specific examples. We find that longer exposure to low-paying jobs, longer exposure to jobs that don't offer private pension plans, having experienced multiple marriages, or never marrying, is associated with lower levels of economic well-being at age 65. Similarly, unstable attachment to the labor force is associated with lower levels of economic well-being, variously measured at age 65, but only for men, not for women. Okay? This may not be so surprising given the cohort that we're talking about here. But the key point to remember is that these relationships are net of a whole host of predictors of economic well-being at age 65. Okay? Similarly, in the studies of the various health measures, longer exposure to low-paying jobs, longer exposure to jobs that don't provide health insurance is associated with worse health at age 65. And never marrying is associated with worse health at age 65, but only for women, not for men. The key point to take from this is these are averages. These are absolutely associational relationships. They say nothing about your own lives. These are averages. So either take heart or don't worry. These are based on, again, like I said, over 8,000 people, and sort of summarizing across those people. And I realize I'm probably running short on time, so I will move the pace, pick the pace up here. The third study, remember, was about the extent, what is it about high school rank that's related to longer lives? And is it the case that this longer lives for people who did better in high school is a reflection of the fact that whatever it is that makes you do, that helps you do well in high school, puts you on more stable and successful life trajectories? So what we do is to first replicate that study that I told you about by the two colleagues who published a paper a while ago, the retired colleagues. And we also find a very powerful negative relationship between high school rank and mortality. People who did better in high school live longer, on average. And I tried to sort of document or describe the strength of the relationship here by the size of the arrow. You'll see a little change. It's a very powerful relationship. What happens when we include the work and family trajectories across the life course? There's still a relationship here, but there's also a strong indirect relationship in exactly the way that we posited. People who do better in high school have more successful, or at least more stable, work and family lives, which contributes to longer lives, lower mortality. But this remains powerful. What happens when we just add educational attainment as a sort of indicator of a successful life? When we add educational attainment, this basically goes to nothing. So really the story is people who do well, and this is men, by the way, men who do well in high school have more stable lives, more successful lives, they get higher education, those factors contribute to longer lives, lower mortality. Not much left over here. For women, the story is different. The pattern here is the same, but this remains much larger and much stronger. So there's something for women, not men, about doing better in high school that's associated with living longer that doesn't have to do with the life you've led. And I don't know what that is. Diet, for example, social relationships, I don't know. That's a question for subsequent research. But I did tell you that we were interested in trying to understand male-female differences. This is the most provocative one that we have found. So, briefly to summarize, life trajectories matter. Stable employment and marriage are associated with better health, economic well-being, and survival. In other words, the path that you take to acquire the predictors of these later life measures of well-being matters above and beyond those proximate predictors. And also, from that last study, we show that early life characteristics, adolescent academic performance, to some degree help set us on paths that are associated with perhaps the ultimate measure of well-being, as I said, mortality. We find in our study that these rich life history data are sometimes, but not always, more informative than simple measures that we might get by just asking people in a survey, tell us about your life retrospectively. I would argue, as somebody who works with these data, that it's important to be collecting these prospective long history data, but we don't find support for that in all cases. Surprisingly, patterns were similar, largely similar for men and women. I really highlighted a few of the differences, but we were struck more by the similarities than we were by the differences. And this is pretty interesting to us because this is still, as I said, a cohort in which the differentiation of men's and women's work and family roles is certainly more pronounced than it is, say, for my generation, my cohort, and subsequent groups. So going forward, the kinds of things that we are interested in are thinking about now life histories as mechanisms of later life stratification. We've shown that lives matter. And we've shown that more successful lives, if you want to think about it this way, might be associated with more successful aging. We know that life histories are associated with things like educational attainment, with race, with ethnicity, with perhaps immigration status, and these kinds of relationships may help us to understand patterns of inequality in older ages in ways that people haven't quite thought about yet. I've mentioned several times the importance of thinking about the changes in women's lives. This is something that we really want to pay attention to as the cohorts of people in which men and women arguably have sort of lived more or less parallel work and family lives into old age. To what extent will these patterns hold, or will they be different? And I've already just briefly highlighted the importance of thinking about racial and ethnic differences. This was a survey of 1957 Wisconsin high school graduates. They're all white. That's not what our older population is going to look like it doesn't look like that today, and it won't look like that certainly in 20 or 30 years. And using other sources of data to try to understand the ways in which these patterns might differ across racial and ethnic groups, or help us to understand racial and ethnic differences in well-being at older ages, is an important subsequent endeavor for us. So thank you very much for your attention.